1972, during negotiations with North Vietnam in Paris, Henry Kissinger uttered a phrase that defined an entire generation of American diplomacy. "We cannot lose. We can only leave." That logic, departure instead of defeat, turned out to be a form of self-deception that cost Washington decades of strategic reputation. Now, 54 years later, we are watching something disturbingly similar. On March 31st, 2026, sitting in the Oval Office of the White House, Donald Trump spoke words that, on the surface, sound like a declaration of victory. When we feel that they have been bombed back to the Stone Age and cannot build a nuclear weapon, then we will leave. Whether we have a deal or not, it does not matter. The president said he expects to withdraw American forces from Iran within 2 to 3 weeks. But here is the question almost nobody is asking. If you are winning, why are you leaving without a deal? In the history of diplomacy, a victor's departure without a binding agreement is not a triumph. It is the prologue to the next war. Let us slow down for a moment and examine what actually lies behind this statement. Not the headline, not the rhetoric, the structure. To understand the meaning of Trump's words, we need to go back to the timeline, not to March 31st, to the beginning. Trump's Iran policy over the past year has passed through 3 distinct phases. The first, in early 2025, combined renewed pressure with intelligence-led diplomacy. Trump formally reinstated his maximum pressure campaign through economic sanctions, but acted inconsistently. In March, he sent a personal letter to Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei proposing direct nuclear talks. 5 rounds of negotiations followed. Both sides entered those talks seriously, but they never advanced beyond atmosphere. Trump was satisfied with burnishing his image as a deal-maker regardless of outcome, and Tehran used the negotiations to signal openness without making real concessions. Then came a sharp rupture. Less than 48 hours before the coordinated U.S. and Israeli strikes that began on February 28th, Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and Trump's son-in-law Jared Kushner met with Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi in Geneva for the 3rd round of Oman-mediated talks. Despite the Omani foreign minister's assessment that the sides had achieved substantial progress, Trump declared he was dissatisfied with the pace of negotiations. Here is a detail that deserves far more attention. By the time the 3rd round of talks ended, Trump had most likely already decided to go to war. But his impatience appears to have been fueled by reports from Witkoff and Kushner. Their comments during 2 press briefings made clear that Witkoff lacked the technical expertise or diplomatic qualifications for effective engagement. His ignorance and mischaracterization of Iran's positions and nuclear program likely shaped Trump's assessment that the talks were going nowhere. And this is a critically important structural point. We are not simply talking about the failure of diplomacy. We are talking about a decision-making system in which personal loyalty has replaced institutional expertise. Where in the past the State Department would deploy professional negotiators with decades of non-proliferation experience, this time a businessman and a family member were sent to Geneva. Moreover, literally the day before the strikes began, the Omani foreign minister announced that a breakthrough had been reached. Iran had agreed never to stockpile enriched uranium and to allow full IAEA verification. Talks were supposed to resume on March 2nd. After the strikes began, he declared that active and serious negotiations had been undermined. Think about that. A diplomatic breakthrough, at least in the mediator's assessment, had been achieved. And less than 48 hours later, the bombing started. This is not a mistake. It is a symptom. Now let us turn to the central question embedded in Trump's statement itself. The president is effectively saying, "We will destroy everything that can be destroyed, and then we will leave. A deal is secondary. We are finishing the job, and I think in about 2 weeks, maybe a little more, we will be done. But we want to destroy absolutely everything." Meanwhile, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth refused to rule out the deployment of ground troops into Iran, stating that the whole point is unpredictability. Approximately 50,000 American service members are deployed in the region, including thousands of Marines and paratroopers from the 82nd Airborne Division. From a purely military standpoint, the United States undeniably possesses overwhelming air superiority. Trump himself declared, "We are absolutely unstoppable. Everything is bombed. We are hitting them very hard." But here is a historical parallel that should give us pause. In 2003, after the fall of Baghdad, George W. Bush landed on the aircraft carrier Abraham Lincoln in front of a banner reading "Mission Accomplished." The military phase of the operation had indeed been completed in 3 weeks. But the political objective, a stable, friendly Iraq, was not achieved in 20 years. Military victory without political settlement is not victory. It is a pause. Iran remains capable and willing to strike back. Tehran continues rocket attacks against American forces and neighboring states. Hegseth acknowledges that the coming days will be decisive while simultaneously asserting that Iran can do virtually nothing about it militarily. There is a fundamental contradiction hidden here. If the adversary can do nothing, why are the coming days decisive? This is a linguistic pattern we have seen in every conflict where military dominance collided with asymmetric resistance: Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan. The IAEA stated that while Iran had an ambitious nuclear program, at the time the war began in 2026, there was no evidence of a structured nuclear weapons program. American intelligence indicated that alleged threats from long-range Iranian ballistic missiles were unfounded, as such capabilities would require development until 2035. This means the stated objective of preventing Iran from obtaining nuclear weapons was based on a threat that, by the administration's own intelligence assessment, was not imminent. The administration offered shifting and varied justifications for starting the war, ranging from a preemptive strike on the nuclear program to seizing oil resources and regime change. Can force produce a political outcome in this case? The answer depends on what you consider an outcome. If the goal is to destroy infrastructure, then yes. If the goal is to create a durable order that prevents nuclear proliferation for decades, that requires architecture that can only be built through a treaty. And Trump is literally saying, a treaty is not necessary. Now let us take a step closer to the ground, to price tags in stores, to gas stations, to what ordinary people feel from Tokyo to Berlin and from Islamabad to Los Angeles. The International Energy Agency characterized the consequences of this conflict as the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. The impact of the conflict echoes the energy crisis of the 1970s through acute supply shortfalls, currency volatility, inflation, and heightened risks of stagflation and recession. Brent crude prices broke through $100 a barrel on March 8th for the first time in 4 years, reaching a peak of $126. The closure of the Strait of Hormuz has been described as the greatest disruption to energy supplies since the crisis of the 70s. The average price of a gallon of gasoline in Los Angeles County rose to $5.99 compared with $4.69 a month earlier. And oil is only the tip of the iceberg. The Persian Gulf region produces nearly half the world's urea and 30% of its ammonia. Roughly a third of the global supply of fertilizers passes through the strait. Urea prices have risen 50%. Disruption to liquefied gas supplies is also creating problems for fertilizer production, which affects Northern Hemisphere agriculture. The price shock and fertilizer shortages during the spring planting season could reduce U.S. corn yields, the primary feed for the meat and dairy industries, and potentially raise global food prices in 2027. Consider that the war in Iran could affect the cost of milk and meat in Iowa 12 months from now. This is not abstract geopolitics. This is a supply chain that begins at the Strait of Hormuz and ends at your dinner table. For Europe, the war has triggered a second major energy crisis, primarily through the suspension of Qatari liquefied gas shipments and the closure of the strait. This has coincided with historically low European gas storage levels, around 30% capacity following the harsh winter of 2025 to 2026. The European Central Bank postponed a planned interest rate cut, raising its 2026 inflation forecast and lowering its GDP growth projection. The EU estimates a 70% rise in gas prices and a 50% rise in oil prices, translating into an additional 13 billion euros in fossil fuel import costs. And now the key point linking economics to Trump's statement. The central question for the global economy is this: is Trump genuinely willing to leave Iran without securing the opening of the Strait of Hormuz, either through diplomacy or force? Trump appears to have walked back earlier promises about reopening the strait. "We will leave very soon," he said. And if France or some other country wants oil or gas, they will go through the Strait of Hormuz, and they will defend themselves. I think it will be safe there, but we have nothing to do with it. What happens with the strait? We will have nothing to do with it. This is a fundamentally new position. Since 1980, since the Carter Doctrine, the United States has guaranteed freedom of navigation in the Persian Gulf as an element of the global order. With a single statement, Trump has called into question 4 decades of strategic commitments. In a Truth Social post, he urged countries experiencing fuel shortages to go and get their oil themselves. The United States will no longer help you, just as you did not help us. Iran is essentially destroyed. The hard part is done. Go get your oil. This is evidence of the dilemma facing a White House torn between grim economic forecasts about the consequences of leaving without unblocking Iranian control of the Strait and an equally strong desire to end American involvement. Let us now zoom out, away from the Strait, away from oil prices, away from the Oval Office. Let us look at how this event is redrawing the very map of global alliances. Let us start with the Transatlantic Alliance. Spain closed its airspace to American military aircraft participating in the war against Iran, forcing them to fly around a NATO member's territory on their way to targets in the Middle East. Spain's Defense Minister Margarita Robles called the war profoundly illegal and profoundly unjust. Italy also denied an American bomber heading to the Middle East permission to land at a base in Sicily. Poland rejected U.S. pressure, with the Deputy Prime Minister stating that Patriot batteries are used to protect Polish skies and NATO's eastern flank, and there are no plans for their redeployment. Germany declared, "This is not our war." German President Steinmeier condemned the war as illegal, saying that this war violates international law and that there is no doubt that the justification of an imminent threat of attack against the United States is untenable. Now consider how unprecedented this is. In NATO history, there have been cases where allies refused cooperation. France and Italy blocked airspace for the operation against Gaddafi in 1986. Turkey did not allow troop passage for the invasion of Iraq in 2003. But even France and Germany, who strongly opposed the Iraq War, permitted American overflight. Spain's position highlights a deeper structural problem within Europe, the absence of a unified foreign policy regarding major conflicts. This ambivalence suggests that Europe does not fully support Spain, but neither is it fully aligned with Washington. The broader European policy toward the Iran war reflects a fundamental contradiction. Europe wants to promote diplomacy and avoid escalation while remaining strategically dependent on the United States for security. And now the key question that follows from Trump's words about allies defending themselves in the Strait. If America says we are leaving, defend yourselves, this is not simply about the Strait of Hormuz. It is an invitation to reconsider the entire security architecture that Washington has built over 70 years. Who benefits from the chaos? India has experienced a reversal. Against the backdrop of its strategic partnership with Israel, the weakening of Indo-Iranian ties, according to critics, has indirectly created a strategic vacuum that has pushed Tehran toward closer military and economic alignment with China and Russia. In 2024, approximately 84% of crude oil shipments through the Strait went to Asian markets, with China receiving a third of its oil via this route. And here is the paradox. Iran continues to ship millions of barrels of oil to China during the conflict. Russia is another beneficiary. Moscow has declared it does not recognize the restored UN sanctions against Iran, while China has called for an end to the promotion of sanctions and the stoking of confrontation. Every day the Strait remains closed, Russian oil and gas become more attractive to Europe. Every time Trump tells allies to defend themselves, Beijing offers an alternative model of partnership. A number of Asian countries, including China, the world's largest oil importer, are restricting exports. South Korea has announced a 5-month restriction on naphtha exports. We are witnessing the formation of what might be called a parallel energy architecture, a system in which China, Russia, and Iran create their own trade routes bypassing American control in the dollar system. This will not happen overnight, but every war like this accelerates the process. Here is a detail that deserves its own conversation. Trump himself described the campaign as major combat operations and acknowledged the possibility of American casualties, recognizing that this often happens in war. But formally, the United States is not in a state of war with Iran. Under the Constitution, only Congress has the authority to declare war. We are observing a war being waged without a formal declaration, without a congressional vote, and yet it is already the largest American military conflict since 2003. The institution of congressional war authorization, one of the oldest democratic checks, is de facto dead, not repealed, simply bypassed. Legal experts have already characterized the initial strike on Iran as an act of unprovoked aggression. The destruction or damage of civilian infrastructure could be considered a war crime under the Geneva Conventions. Amnesty International called plans to bomb Iranian power stations a threat to commit war crimes. And what about diplomatic channels? Tehran rejected the U.S. 15-point peace plan last week, while the administration's justifications for starting the war have shifted throughout the conflict, generating uncertainty. Some days the president uses absolutist language about the need to immediately open the strait. Monday's ultimatum was at least the fifth. On other days, he downplays the waterway's significance and falsely claims the United States has no dependence on it. Within a few hours on Sunday, Trump first told reporters he was almost certain a deal was close, and then told the Financial Times the U.S. could seize Iran's oil hub and take the oil. These are not simply mixed signals. This is the absence of a strategic center of gravity. When a leader oscillates between peace in 2 weeks and seizing oil within a single day, this does not speak to unpredictability as a tactic. It speaks to a system making decisions without a stable doctrine. Recall how decisions were formed during the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. Kennedy assembled ExComm, a committee of diplomats, military leaders, and experts who spent a week deliberating every scenario. That was an institutional process engineered to slow down decision-making in a crisis. What we see now is the opposite, an acceleration of decisions removed from traditional institutions and delegated to a narrow circle of personal advisors. Let us now take the widest possible step back. Forget the next 2 or 3 weeks. Think about how this event reshapes the world by 2030 to 2035. First, the non-proliferation doctrine lies in ruins. If the outcome of this war is that a country which was negotiating and which, by the mediator's assessment, was close to an agreement, was attacked during those negotiations, what signal do other states receive? The answer is simple. Nuclear weapons are the only guarantee. Libya gave up its program in 2003 and was destroyed in 2011. Ukraine surrendered its arsenal in 1994 and was invaded in 2022. Iran was negotiating and was attacked. Each of these precedents reinforces the same logic. If you do not have the bomb, you are vulnerable. Second, energy deglobalization. The scale of the shock emanating from the Gulf right now could mean a loss of 5 to 10 million barrels per day, an impact analogous to the 70s. The energy transition will be imposed on us in a very painful way. The world after this crisis will build parallel energy systems, and each of them will be less efficient, more expensive, and more politicized. Third, the end of security guarantees as currency. Rubio effectively raised the question of NATO's purpose. If NATO is only about us defending Europe in case of attack, but we are denied the use of bases when we need them, that is not a very good deal. It is hard to stay engaged and say this benefits the United States. All of this will need to be reconsidered. And when America questions the value of NATO, every small and mid-sized ally begins searching for alternative guarantees. China, Russia, even India, all of them stand ready. We began with a parallel to Vietnam. Allow me to end with another. In 1956, during the Suez Crisis, Britain and France attacked Egypt to regain control of the Suez Canal. The military operation was successful, but Dwight Eisenhower forced them to retreat, not because they lost on the battlefield, but because the logic of the global order demanded a different outcome. Suez became the moment the world understood British hegemony was over. Not with a bang, with a quiet retreat. Trump's statement, "We will leave whether we have a deal or not," may look like a show of strength. But within the structure of history, it sounds different. It is an admission that the war's central objective was not achieved through force, that the strait is not open, that allies did not rally behind, that economic consequences press harder than the Iranian military. And here is the question I want to leave you with, not as an audience, but as people living inside a system that is being restructured right now. If the world's largest military power can start a war without congressional approval, conduct negotiations through relatives instead of diplomats, change its justifications every 48 hours, and then leave declaring that a deal does not matter, then what exactly prevents the next war from starting on the same logic? Perhaps the answer will not comfort us. But to ask the question is already to reject the illusion that someone at the top is controlling the system. Because the system is not one person in the Oval Office. The system is whether institutions function when one person decides he does not need them.